Now I wanted to explain a little bit about composition using this painting I'm working on right now. And one of the things about composition is that you assign, using a variety of methods, attraction to objects in your painting. For example, if I have an object that has high contrast in it, in other words, it's a very light object against a very dark object, and let's say it's the very lightest object in the painting against the very darkest object or area, that's going to be an area of attraction. Now this area right here is probably the most visually attractive area in this composition. You can also create a linear path through the painting by using composition. And there are several lines here that I'm going to point out. The most obvious line is an arcing line right there. Now there's another less obvious line, and it's this bit of white here, down this, down this, down this. So that creates a line. Now just like you can create a line with a series of dots or a series of dashes, you can create lines in your composition to direct the eye using intermittent objects. Another line is kind of the horizon line here. So we have the intersection of three basic arcs. The top one here, this one here, and then the water line here. There was a famous critic by the name of John Ruskin back in the Victorian age, and he said that any area of color or texture or whatever in a painting is more beautiful if it has a transition in it. So if an area of color is transitioning, it's more interesting to the eye. Now the reason for this is because it gives a sense of motion to that area. You know, if we look at this area here, it goes from a light area at the top down to a dark. And this your eye tends to move towards the lighter area, so your eye will be moving across here. So that creates an area that's moving the eye towards the focal point. You can see that a little bit over here too, the transition here. So it's moving things towards the center. Sometimes in photographs you'll see, very obviously using the edges of a photograph, to be darker, and that'll attract the eye inward, and that creates more attraction towards the center. But anything can have that sense of direction in it. This rock here has a gradation in it, and it moves your eye across like this. Looking for this rock here has the same thing. It has a gradation. So the more important your design is, or your composition, the more basic your painting structure will probably want to be. Now this is a fairly realistic painting. There's a lot of thick paint down here, but the overall effect is one of realism. And when you paint like this, you can have a lot of subtlety in the areas. And this actually is one way that realist painters create an artistic effect in a painting and still look very realistic. Some people that aren't very sophisticated will look at a realistic painting and they'll say, well, why didn't you just use a photograph? And they're just completely missing the fact that the artist has very artfully used transitions, very subtle transitions throughout the various shapes and objects in their painting to very skillfully guide the eye through that painting. That's why you can see a painting, it looks fairly realistic, and yet you have a sense of the eye really goes through that space and really explores that space. And that's the artist using very subtle manipulation, using line and gradation to direct the eye through the space, and you have a sense of an artistic journey or a visual journey through that space. you start with trying to keep the eye away from the edges. I talked about this in another video, and I'll put a link up to that video, that a blank canvas has two points of attraction, the center and the edges. So if this canvas were completely blank, just filled with, blue paint or whatever, your eye would kind of go to the center and it would dart off to the edge and just go back and forth. And the artistic compositional project is to try to divert the eye from those kind of stereotypical, maneuvers back and forth to the edge, to the middle, and start to direct the eye in a very systematic and logical way through the painting. And it's part of the painter's art. Some people just do this intuitively. They know intuitively what the artist's job is, and so they just subconsciously load all these methods of directing the eye into their paintings. Others of us have had to kind of ferret out, why artists, or how artists can control your eye through a space, through a two-dimensional space. One thing that if you've read anything in my blog or seen my other videos, is that I really am kind of moving away from the theory of just dividing your painting up into thirds, and then placing your objects in those those quadrants, with intersecting lines here and here, because that's just too predictable. It is a way to start your compositional explorations, but it's just too primitive to really last very long if you really want to explore composition. So I think a much more interesting route is to talk about, you might say, the gravitational attraction of objects that you put in your two-dimensional space. Now, a good example of how to make things more attractive to the eye is, for example, this might be a little bit too attracting the eye too much, and I can simply glaze that down, make it darker, more of this value here, and your attention will automatically shift over here. If I wanted to reduce the attraction on this line here, which is very magnetic to the eye, I could reduce the value of this shape here and lighten this shape so that these are more similar, and the contrast will be much, much less. So it therefore attracts the eye less. Now, one shape that's creating a little bit of problem is this shape right here. And the reason it's creating a problem is because it's just very flat. There's no gradation, there's no linear movement through here. There's a little bit, but it's very subtle, and the values are very minimal. So I probably am going to add some more of this, water that's kind of foaming through here to try to divert the eye back. And I may try to lighten this side so that this kind of has a gradation from here to here. Because right now, the eye is sort of circling through the seam. And when it gets over here, it kind of there's this kind of a linear thing going on here, and it just directs the eye out of the painting. And you don't want to help people, leave their experience, leave the process. So there's an exit point there that I need to resolve if I'm going to fully make this composition really work. There's a metaphor in this painting, obviously, the roiling water, and I want to try to sort of imitate that, the roiling of the eye, you might say, through the space. It's kind of tricky, but I should be able to get that. Now, when people look at a painting, they detect your intent. You're communicating something to them, and when you effectively do that, even if they don't consciously understand it, they know that something's happening here. There's some kind of pattern, there's some kind of intent here that's being recognized by them, and it gives pleasure to the mind. There's just sort of we derive a satisfaction from seeing this kind of intention in a work of art. That's why a play or a movie that has sort of, subconscious content, or, a subtext or a subplot, can be very fascinating, very, delightful, you might say, to the viewer. I think that's the main problem with composition sometimes, is that the artist either doesn't understand how to put that intention into there, and they don't do it intuitively. So if you find that you just are not, socking in that level of meaning into a visual idea, you might want to explore composition a little bit more, and see if you can, create these visual metaphors, and, in your visual work. There's an analog to poetry, the idea of, repetition, rhythm, which is also a musical term, of course. So there are other art forms that, partake of a lot of the same kind of meaning that we can, add to our paintings.